Welcome to Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff. This show is designed to highlight the work of leaders here in the United States and then beyond. Today with us, Governor David Paterson. And Governor David Paterson was the 55th governor of the state of New York. Let's all welcome David Paterson. It is a great honor to have you on the show. And I want to thank you for coming again once to LTV East Hampton to speak about your work as governor and your work for the state of New York.
Well, thank you, Jean. I've been on before, and it's always a privilege to be invited back. So I'm happy to be here.
You became a governor in 2008, just before the Great Recession. You took over when Eliot Spitzer resigned. What was it like to take over in the midst of a scandal that Eliot Spitzer had been involved with?
Well, it was absolutely shocking because I had gone out to dinner with my family the night before, and the next morning everybody went to school and to work, and I came to Albany, and they just asked me if I would go to a family planning event in place of the governor, which I felt I had no notice, and I told them, I'll do it, but I'm a little busy over here. Now, lieutenant governor is never busy. Don't ever let a lieutenant governor tell you they're busy, but we have pride. So I was trying to say that they didn't give me enough notice. So I finished the family planning event. I went back to the Capitol, and I'm sitting in my office, and they call a second time. They said that the cardinal is coming at 1:30 in the afternoon. He's bringing all the bishops. The governor can't get there on time. You're going to have to do the meeting. This is when I put my foot down. I explained to them that a meeting between a governor and a cardinal is head of state to head of state meeting. And I use the analogy that Queen Elizabeth is coming to the White House and President Bush doesn't get there on time. He can't send Cheney. Though in that case, maybe he could, since it seemed like Cheney was running the place anyway. But what I'm really saying is it was inappropriate. It was not protocol to do that. And they kept pushing. They said, the governor wants you to go. I'm not going. Finally, at 1 o'clock, they call and they tell me this story. And the governor's secretary, he is whispering into the phone to me, and I can only make out half of what he said. So he texts my chief of staff, who comes up to the office, and he says, so I said to him, oh, what was it? There was some kind of investment club and the money went into a prostitution ring, and Eliot's money was in there. And he said, no, the governor was in there, and the governor's going to resign at 2:15. And I said, what time is it now? He said 1:15. So there was more than a little bit of anxiety that I felt that particular day. But the other thing I thought about was that I had warned the governor not to have the amount of spending in the budget as it stood at that particular time. There was going to be a 5.6% increase in spending. But it seemed to me that all the financial indicators were that we were going to have a real difficult year. Poor collections of tax receipts in the fourth quarter of 2007, and here we are in the middle of 2008, adding to the spending. I realized later on that the governor did that just to try to appease his legislative colleagues, who had really grown tired of him at that particular point. And within the next couple of days, he resigned. And now my wish came true, not that I wanted to become governor, but that we could cut the spending from that year. And I brought the legislature back in the summer in a campaign year. Not a very good time to ask your colleagues in government to come to Albany, but they came there and they helped reduce the budget deficit by a little over $2 billion. And here's where I made, I think, the biggest mistake I made when I was governor. I should have congratulated them and spoken positively about them for the rest of the summer. But the problem was I hadn't really changed the staff much. And the staff that was there was really Spitzer's staff. And they were about calling people out and embarrassing them and almost acting as if they weren't in government, criticizing the elected officials. And they kind of got me into that a little bit. And I found that ruined a very good relationship that I had with the legislature up to that point. And that's the thing. If I had something to do over again, I would have changed my conduct in that case.
And so how did the people of the state respond to the $2 billion budget cut?
Well, I think that the people of the state really liked it. My approval rating went up to 64%, and I'd only been there for a few months, and Spitzer's approval rating was 68% at the time he left. But the special interests didn't like it at all. And what I learned was the special interests are not just unions and school districts and, maybe the prototypical Democratic supporters. The special interest was everybody. So what the Republicans did to try to counter it was to say that I misestimated the revenue projection, which was really unfair because everybody knew. By this time, we were in May, June, July of 2008, and everything's falling apart. The auto industry got reprimanded and brought to Washington, D.C. for their poor activity. The market was down. Everything was basically going wrong. And yet there were still people in the midst of it who would pretend just to get their hands on some resources that we weren't having the deep economic problem that we now all know that we had, because the inevitable budget deficit that I had to close was $21.3 billion in the 2008-2009 budget and $40.3 billion for the 3 years that I was there.
I remember that recession well. It was a very tough time for many businesses and for many, many people. Now, David, you grew up on Long Island, and I think the story of you and your mother and what she did for your education is a very interesting one and a very important one. And would you tell our audience a little bit about what it was like to grow up on Long Island and what your mother did? She moved from New York City to Long Island for your education. And tell us a little bit more about that, because I think it's just wonderful.
So my mother was shocked to find out a year before I would become school age that the New York City public school system would not put a blind child in the class with the other students. They had these special remote areas that they took the disabled students and were probably basically just warehousing them, giving them little things to do, pushing them through the system, but they weren't really learning. They weren't at the level that the other children were. So my mother went around the state, and she went to Westchester and she went to different places. Finally, she found that the village of Hempstead, in the town of Hempstead on Long Island, had been mainstreaming disabled students in to the classes with the other kids. And she was told that if she moved her family out to Long Island, that the school system would take me. Now, my father was a lawyer at the time who was interested in politics and was thinking about running for office and had a lot of plans, and he would inevitably fulfill all of those plans. But he got moved to Hempstead with the rest of us. So you can see who was running the show in that relationship. But it really, if that wasn't the case, Jean, I don't know that I'd be sitting here having this conversation with you right now. Even when I got to Hempstead and was in the school with the other students, my first day of school, the kindergarten teacher asked my mother to take me home for a week while she got the class settled down. And then, as she said, we'll bring David in with the other students. My mother told her that she was a school teacher at PS 116 in Jamaica, Queens, and she'll get the class settled down herself in 20 minutes. And then she added, and my son will be sitting there. So after a little discussion with the principal, while I would not compare this incident to the desegregation in Little Rock, it was a big moment for me. And inevitably, I think it was a big moment for other disabled students, particularly blind students, that somebody got into the public school system and was able to not only graduate, but to flourish. I actually graduated a year earlier than the rest of my class, years later.
Wow. And then you went on to college and then law school, correct?
Yes, and there's where I had some problems because at least in the public school system in elementary and high school, there were a lot of alternatives and a lot of assistance that I got. But now being in a school where, there aren't, you're doing research, you're taking different classes, there's a lot of books you have to get from the library and read them. Whereas most of the books that I read in elementary and high school were already printed. So we knew at the beginning of the semester what the class would be like, but you couldn't do that in a college because it was what each individual professor wanted you to do. So I struggled through those periods and, had some moments when I really wasn't sure if I could really get through, but it always seemed that the right person turned out at a certain time to help me. And one particular professor was a man named Basil Rauch, who oddly enough had the same first name as my father. And he was talking to me about President Roosevelt. And now President Roosevelt was carried into the 1932 Democratic National Convention when he himself wanted to walk into the convention. And I couldn't see it as clearly in the picture, but he showed me how Roosevelt was really upset, but how he turned this anger into policy and all the great things that he did. And Roosevelt had swam in the swimming pool at the executive mansion in Albany, where the governor lives, to prepare to walk in. And when they carried him, he got really upset, but then he got over it. And then he obviously had 13 years of tremendous service to our country. So he was saying to me that you have to not allow yourself to be captured by the situations that you face that no one else has faced. You've got to find your own way to put it all together and make it work for you. And I am forever beholden to him, because I would say it was that meeting somewhere, I don't know, 1973 or something like that, where I think I turned it around, stopped reacting to everything that went wrong, and started thinking of creative ways to solve problems.
And do you think that the educational system today does enough for people with disabilities?
Well, it probably doesn't, but one of the issues that the administrations face, and here I have to kind of stick up for them for a little bit, is there's been an alarming increase in children who are in school now who are defined as being disabled. So I was the only one in the school that I went to at that particular time in the early 60s. Now you have all kinds of not only children that have issues, but also the types of issues that they have, from learning disabilities to speech and language issues to autism to just so many difficulties. It's very hard for the educational system to be able to come up with the right person to try to help them at that particular time. And that really was something that was on my mind when I was governor, because I at least wanted to try to give back to the children of that generation what I was fortunate enough to receive many years before. But it was a hard thing to do, particularly when you have inexorable budget problems, and also the proliferation of taxes that are in some ways diminishing the opportunity to give the educational system, probably the most important one in government, all the tools that it needs to solve today's problems.
And Governor, first, I want to thank you for your service. You've been an incredible leader for the state of New York and for people really not only in New York, but around our country and then the globe. And Governor, after your term finished, what did you do next?
After my term finished, I went to work for a a gentleman who was trying to build these cul-de-sacs with for very wealthy properties, but he wanted them to be completely managed by environmental cures. So, different ways of water treatment, different ways of growing grass so that it wouldn't damage the economy. A lot of people who have a lot of wealth live near golf courses. Golf courses are probably the biggest offenders of environmental policy, just the way everything looks good, but it really isn't. So I went and helped him raise money for this particular cause. Then I went on to teach at Touro University, where I still teach, and now am in the administrative office as a vice president. And I, after that, went to work for the Las Vegas Sands Corporation. That's the integrated resorts who are trying to win one of the contracts here in New York State for the 3 facilities that they will open probably by the end of this year. So I've certainly spent a lot of time working, but it's also been an opportunity to kind of look back and examine government and think about how things could be a little different than the way I did them, or maybe how things could be a little different than the way people are handling government today.
For our audience, we are with Governor David Paterson, the 55th governor of the state of New York. Now, Governor Paterson, you've done a lot for people with disabilities, and you spoke a little bit about what you're doing to me yesterday when we had a 5-minute phone call, but describe a little bit about what you're doing and why it's so important to you and to others.
Well, I was on the board of the American Foundation for the Blind. I was actually in government. I had to resign from it when I became governor. I then went to work for the National Federation of the Blind, who I think is the most active and the most productive resource for people who are blind. I was on the board of the League for the Hard of Hearing right here in New York City. And so what I've done is to try to put myself in decision-making capacities and perhaps draw on my government service to determine how whichever organization I'm working with can be better served, and also can learn the facilities of how to approach government for assistance. Sometimes people just write a letter, and if they don't get a letter back, they just walk away from what they really need. There are other ways to get the attention of people in government, and it's really helped me to cope with a feeling sometimes, because of what I was able to achieve, that I wasn't really all that disabled. I've read that sometimes from people who had no idea what they were writing about. And what I really wanted to convey to other people who have suffered from blindness, or if they're deaf, or ambulatory issues, and even issues involving mental health, those disabilities, is that I've always wanted to convey to them that I'm really no different than you. But I may have gotten, at the time I was in need, better services than you did. And what we should be doing right now is to try to restore for all, particularly young people who suffer from disabilities, what we were probably able to do for younger people years ago. But again, that exponential component, Jean, is there's so many more young people with these types of problems, and it's almost hard to keep track of it.
And why do you think that there are so many more young people with disabilities? Or is it just the way we're categorizing people today? Or not me or others, but the system and the school system? Or what do you think is happening right now?
It may be related to the parents, particular habits that were, conveyed through childbirth to that generation. We have much higher infant mortality in the first months of life than we had years ago, and nobody can kind of put their finger on what that particularly is. And then I think in addition to that, we have, as a society, widened the scope of what would constitute a disability. So there were people who got through the educational system, but it was never really known what some of their problems were. There was a guy who I went to first grade with, and we went all through junior high school together. We went to the same high school, and he just never seemed to understand what was going on. Even though when we got outside of school, he was a wonderful friend and a really good person. And I hadn't seen him in years. And I believe just about a year and a half ago, we had a little reunion of, those of us that knew each other when we were younger. And at the dinner, he was talking about this company he runs and this, this type of thing. And it turned out he got diagnosed in his mid-20s as having attention deficit disorder. And they were able to treat it, and he was able to understand how to work with it. And all of a sudden, here he is, a wholly owned subsidiary. He's an entrepreneur. And I just thought that was the most wonderful feeling. But the one thing he did say was that he knew that there was something wrong, but he never appreciated the way other people treated him. And I remember that other people didn't treat him particularly well, not much better than they treated me. But it was wonderful to see that. And part of that was that had he been in the school system now, I'll bet he'd have been tested younger, and who knows, may have gone on to have a greater life than he has even now.
Hard to know, but I do think that having programs for people with disabilities is very, very important. And many people, like myself, we want to know, what can we do to be more helpful to people with disabilities? And David, you having a disability with your eyesight, you're probably one of the best people to answer this question.
Well, I think that every human being that processes the fact that they've now become an adult, the first thing that they all would really like to do is have a job. Now, when I'm in college at Columbia, I'm on the dean's list. I go to a barbecue one summer, and the man who was home we were visiting, his wife was a special itinerant teacher for the disabled students. And so she was my teacher, and they were friends of the family. And he said to this friend of mine, we're starting a catering service for some of the day camps during the summer. And we are trying to find like 15 kids who can pack the lunches. And he said, I want you to go out and find me 15 kids. So I said to the man, I'll help him. So we put 13 kids' names on the list and added our names, and he hired everyone except me. And even when he realized that my parents were upset that he didn't hire me, his way of fixing the problem was to hire my brother. Like, that really helped. It just compounded the problem for me. My brother was underage. He shouldn't have been working there in the first place. And I should have been working there, but was discriminated against. And I never forgot that, because I think whenever you're around people who have any types of disabilities, and I'm not saying that everybody can do every job, but what I am saying is there are a lot of people who can do a lot more than it appears that they can do. And I don't think they always get the right chance. And that's why when I came into office, I hired a few of them.
And I agree with you completely that we need to give or have more jobs available to people with disabilities and more opportunity. And I think if we all concentrate on that, and if our government focuses on that, we'll get there. Now, David, you recently wrote a book, and we have a few minutes left. I'd love for you to talk about that book and then go back to the topic of how we can help.
Well, the name of my book is Black, Blind, and in Charge. It may not be the best book, but it's got to have one of the best titles. It was the title came to me from a friend of mine who lived in Australia, who actually was the editor of the book. And I think it's really just me recounting situations that occurred in my life, and some of the wonderful moments and some of the pitfalls and some of the interesting people that I met during that particular time. And I'm really glad that I waited to write it until about 2018. If I'd written it the day I came out of office, I would have been settling a lot of scores. And while that might have been cleared my conscience on some issues, I don't think it would have been interesting reading. Here, I really tried to adapt a sense of humor to some of the same situations that aggravated me when I was, in office and in government even before I was in office. And really wanted it also to be a tribute to any of the people who suffered from some of the issues that I did. I'm legally blind, and that as they come along, that they can see that somebody was able to accomplish a lot who's probably no smarter than them. And I think that's who I dedicated the book to, and what I thought would be the real value of it. And because I think I would have really benefited had I known someone like myself back many years ago. But at that time, there weren't too many people who had disabilities or were in some of the situations that I was in that were in position to actually help me.
Yes, and we have about 30 seconds left. What advice would you give to a young person just starting out who might have a disability such as the one you have?
Well, the advice that even that we all know when we ride in a car and we look straight forward, that the rear view mirror takes up far less space than the mirror at the front of the car, meaning that whatever went on in the past, you're leaving it. And what you're seeing coming into view in the future is where you are now. And so you should always concentrate more on what's in store for you rather than what happened to you.
Well, thank you, Governor Paterson. You have been a wonderful guest, and I'm truly honored to have the opportunity to interview you once more, because you've done so much for the country and you've done so much for so many other people. Thank you. This concludes Successful Philanthropy. Our guest today, Governor David Paterson. I'm Jean Shafiroff, your host. I'll see you next week.